My name's Emily Holland. I'm the editor of Poet Lore, which is America's oldest poetry magazine, and we are published at the Writers' Center in print twice a year. This is our latest issue, hovering behind me, featuring a guest edited folio by Tarfia Faizullah on surrealism and strangeness. Our next issue is coming out hopefully next month, barring any production delays, and it's guest edited with Benjamin Garcia on the theme of punctuation. So super cool poems happening in the journal. Please check us out at poetlore.com through the link in the chat if you want to subscribe. Our submissions are open until the end of the month, so you have a couple more days to get those poems into our queue if you have some ready. A couple things before we begin. Please, please, please support our author tonight and purchase Adam's book, Green Regalia. I know that you will love it. I know you'll love it even more after we talk about it. So please, please buy the book. We have the link to the bookshop page in the chat, which supports independent booksellers, or go to your local independent bookseller and pick it up there, or request a copy for your library. And then also, as we chat, if you have a question, feel free to throw it into the chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on everything there so that we can incorporate your audience questions as we go. I would much rather ask your questions than mine, though I have a lot of questions, so I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about with Adam, but that is everything. So without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome you all to the Writers' Center Virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Adam Tavel joining us as tonight's guest. Hi, Adam.
I forgot to unmute. Hello, Emily. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. Just to start us off, would you mind reading a poem or two? And then, as we go through the chat, maybe we could read a couple more as we go. But yeah, just kick us off.
Absolutely. Well, let me just thank you and Zach and Amy and everybody else at the Writers' Center for having me. I read at the Writers' Center a decade or so ago, I think, in person, which seems like a different lifetime, but it's really an honor and a pleasure. And as a Maryland poet, to have a little local love means a lot. So thank you all. I thought I would just begin with two short poems. They're both sonnets, and they're both poems that I've never actually read out loud before. So I thought there might be some little pleasure in that. The first, they're both a little wry in tone, which is something that, occasionally a sonnet must do. But the first is called Dear Reader, and I wrote it for all of you beautiful strangers. For all I know, you hate the squeak of shoes across your kitchen tile, the nervous way I clear my throat when conversations turn to whine, or just the sight of ponytails on men whose temples gray. I have no clue what you can't forgive. Your window frames a different smidge of earth. Sometimes I yearn to sing the birthday song into a wail, but mime my tuneless lips instead. Silence makes a melody of awkward air that later blows the candles out. My gift is a small token wrapped hysterically with the obituary page. If you sift, you'll find the one who clutched at sirens. So it's a poem I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago at a bouncy house. I don't remember the origin stories or creation stories of a lot of my poems, but I remember that one came in something, at least the first draft of it came in something of a flash when I was at a bouncy house with an indoor bouncy house with my sons on a rainy day. It was a good memory. Not all poems come from good memories, right? The other poem I'd like to read, and then we can just chat for a while, is the title poem of the book, Green Regalia, which is a poem that is slippery and still feels slippery to me. And I'll just preface it by just offering two things very quickly. One is, for those of you who are not from the mid-Atlantic, the part of Maryland I live on, the Delmarva Peninsula, right on the Chesapeake, really is the birthplace of American slavery. And it is, I am an hour away from the birthplace of both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And that's a somber and sobering fact. And the other is that for many years, my polling place as a voter was a freedmen's church that was founded in the 1840s, just about 5 or 6 miles down the road from my home. I live out in the country. And about a decade ago, it was the site of an attempted and thankfully failed arson. And this poem is really about that and about the relationship to memory and place. But it's also a poem about cutting grass. Green Regalia. Just shy 5 miles, our richest neighbor mows, masked with his oxygen. His cheeks spill out and jiggle when he turns his orange machine for rows on acres of a lawn so vast, he sometimes rides in rain or dark, his beer clutched like a torch. I'm the sore buffoon who always waves, jogging away from 40. One time, he gave a reflex shoe. The green regalia he sprays across our country road is shy the Freedmen's Church, with all its plaques, where those of us with ladders keep up the paint. Where once a boy shaped like his son was seen with hoods on Halloween, too drunk to burn, green doors they lit and fled, saved by the storm.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for reading those. I'm excited that you read 2 sonnets because I had a lot of questions regarding the form and things like that. And of course, the title poem will definitely come up. So appreciate that. Real quick, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are in your own words?
Yeah, so I'm a Marylander, I'm a proud Marylander. I'm a crab and Orioles guy. I have 3 children, 3 sons, so I don't sleep much. And Green Regalia was just published about 5-6 weeks ago. It's my 5th book. It has leapfrogged my 4th book, which will be out sometime later this year. It's hit a little bit of a production snag, but it's coming. And I'm a poet who writes a lot about memory. I write a lot about the relationship between the personal and the public. And I'm someone who believes passionately that as the world's oldest art form, poetry belongs to all of us, and that we are living through a poetic renaissance here in this country. And I'm just honored to be a passenger on it.
I love that. Thank you. And please, 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 everyone, buy a copy of the book. You will not regret it. I picked mine up. I think Politics and Prose had it on the shelf a little early. So I was like, ooh, this is out. Let me snag it. So
I didn't even, I'm tickled. I will admit, Emily, I've never been there because every time I'm in DC, I have kids. And hey guys, let's go to a poetry bookstore is always a hard sell. So maybe in the next summer or 2, I'll make my way there, but I'm honored to know that it's there.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely there, and I hope thriving. So, all right, let's start with our maybe most difficult question, which is about, things that maybe go unnoticed in your work by others. So is there something that you wish someone would ask you about your poems, or something that you've never been asked before, but is something that you do that is conscious in your mind when you're putting together the collections?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question. It's a difficult one. I'll confess that I don't get opportunities to talk about my work all that often, but when they do come up, folks often notice that a lot of my work is historical, but they never really ask why or why I'm interested in history, or I've done a lot of work in all of my books with the dramatic monologue or the persona poem. And so, I've written in the voice of Napoleon and the Wolfman and all manner of historical figures, Barabbas and many others. And I think often that's something that people enjoy in my work, but for me, it's something much deeper, which is we're not going to understand the various messes that we're facing as a species and as a country, unless we have some sense of the moral failures and the moral victories of the past. And I feel that one of the things I lament deeply is that there's so little ecumenical thinking right now. We don't think about the human family very often. We don't think about, what we can all do together. And this is a book that clearly touches on issues of environment and climate change. And my sense of history is a tragic one, but my sense of history is also a hopeful one, because I'm hoping that as the Greeks did, by really looking tragedy in the face, we can maybe prevent ourselves from becoming one. And I think we have the tools to do this. And the older I get, the more I feel that, I'm called to write about the times we live in, and I'm called to engage the realities of the present. And I find them to be very bleak. But I think history has to be a lighthouse that guides us through some of these things. Otherwise, we're just going to, muck around and bumble and blame each other.
Yeah. No, that's poignant. I think I had maybe some lines of questioning around persona poems, but I think thinking about the historical context and what we're learning by sort of inhabiting these voices is really interesting and not often talked about. To go off script a little bit, how much of those sort of historical poems is based in research for you? Do you have like a research process?
Yeah, I do. And I appreciate you asking that as sort of a follow-up. So my wife and I met as history majors. My first degree was in history. I worked for both the Maryland State Archives and the Smithsonian briefly, as I was finishing up my undergraduate time. And I really thought I was going to be an archivist, and I probably could have had a very pleasant, calm, quiet career looking at microfiche. But the truth of the matter is I just found it soul crushing. I was working on a grant-funded project on the Underground Railroad, and I didn't have the emotional or mental equipment to continue that sort of work, because it requires, I realize it's not the same as being a homicide detective, but it felt like social work, and I couldn't quite do it. I think that is a point in my life where my love of writing, my love of poetry sort of took me somewhere else. But I say that because I do feel an obligation too, when one is choosing a historical voice, to honor them. And there's some monologues that I've written and published when I was younger that in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have. I have a poem in my second book in the voice of Frederick Douglass's mother. And I labored over the poem for months and months. And I was really trying to honor her, because she has no voice in the historical record. And I thought, well, how would she sound? But it's not a poem that perhaps I should have given myself permission to write, and owning that and being candid enough with oneself about learning from, the poems we write and carrying forward to the next poem. I think that that's crucial too. So it's a combination of, I think, real research and honoring the facts, but also trying to honor the emotional and human elements as well. And that is a fraught task. And sometimes we think we're up for it and we're not, but only time can teach us,
Yeah. Thank you for that honest answer too. I think that's something that isn't talked about that often is, what you go through when you're growing as a poet. And, I feel like maybe all of us have something that we published before that we're like looking back, would I publish that? Would I have kept that to myself? And I think being honest with ourselves about how you grow as a writer and as a member of the poetry community too, it's really important.
And I would just add as a quick footnote, for those of us who are invested, not just in poetry as readers or as writers, but, think of ourselves in a very, broad sense, part of a sort of poetry community. There's been several instances in the past decade, at least, of, appropriation and, people writing in vernacular that perhaps they have no right to claim. And, I find all of this appalling. And I think that we need to continue to have these conversations. And, who we resurrect and who we give ourselves permission to write about, I think is an essential question for anybody who wants to, explore the monologue as a form. And we got to hold ourselves accountable and also each other.
Yeah, that's important too. The sort of not only yourself, but the networking with the community as well. So I hope everyone's taking notes, because this chat is, we're dropping the truth bombs right at the beginning here. All right, let's get to the sonnet, because that is obviously a very important form for the book. There are a lot of sonnets. So just to talk just sort of early on, what attracts you to that form, and how did you approach the amount of sonnets that you were engaging with in this form and keeping them feeling fresh and new on the page, while also sort of using the form to its best capabilities?
If you had told me at 19 or 20 that I would at any point in my life, let alone attempt anything in meter or rhyme, let alone, embrace it and write hundreds of poems in form, I would have just laughed in your face and gone off to do whatever knucklehead thing I was doing at the time. And so I'm still, mystified that I've I had a colleague introduce me to someone as a formalist a few years ago, pre-COVID, and I thought, I'm a formalist? Geez. But I say that because it's happened against my will. And that shows the magnetism of the sonnet, that even people like me are drawn to its power, its energy, its potential. But for about 15 years, I've been something of a trailer park formalist. And what I mean by that is I appreciate form and its tradition, its history. But I think, we're constantly remaking and renewing these things. And as the Golden Shovel teaches us, and as, these new permutations of the American sonnet, from Wanda Coleman to Terrence Hayes, the reminders that it's plastic, it's a suggestion. It's sort of like these people who go bonkers over grammar, like, oh no, we can't change this rule that we ourselves made up, and if we search it up, only probably dates to the 50s anyway. We are the stewards of language, we're the stewards of tradition, and we can celebrate these things by breathing new life into them. I think that one of the reasons I was drawn to the sonnet was its brevity and its punchiness. And one of the gifts that I was given in my life in my mid to late 20s was a very early but necessary retirement from alcohol. And not only did that allow me to become a father, but it also allowed me to really get serious about what I feel called to do, which is be a poet. And, the circumstances of me turning to form, I was hurt into poetry at 12 or 13, as many of us are, right? We're hurt into it. But I was also redeemed in some ways. It's a little pretentious. I don't want to use redeemed. I was guided by a sort of renewed discovery of form at a time in my life where I needed something to contain, some way to try and give shape to what felt like some chaotic things. And once you start having children, the sonnet becomes even more attractive because it's brief. And so it is the kind of thing that you can, with a few cups of coffee, meaningfully explore during nap time. And I want to give a shout out to any moms or dads or caretakers or guardians who are with us tonight and who care for others, whether they're children or those with special needs or aging folks in the family. Those obligations are serious in balancing a writing life with them. But form can be a gift if we let it be.
Yeah, that's great for our audience to hear, because I think a lot of times when we learn form, we're given the rules and then it feels so difficult because we're like, well, now I have to do this. Now I have to rhyme this with that. And I have to make it this long. And it feels constraining. But when you use the phrase using it as a container, and I think that is a beautiful way to put it,
Yeah.
because you can think of all of that it holds and all that you can fit into it. And you mentioned its punchiness, and I just think some of your end lines
Hmm.
in the book were so punchy and great. I mean, I just opened to companion planting,
Oh yeah.
and the end line, they'll stain with petals littered down their hoods. I mean, I think the sonnet has a way with them, especially if you use meter, the way that the last line hits is very satisfying, and can kind of like turn the whole poem on its head.
I appreciate that, and I'll confess, I've tried to really in my, you know, COVID has been such a monumental shift for all of us, and it's been so bleak. But there have been these like little gifts of self-discovery with some of this alone time, and I've tried to cure myself of a lot of the silly vanities that maybe we all kind of privately harbor. But one of the things I probably will never let go of is I do love the sonnet quality of poetry. And when all else fails, the sense of music and the sense of the ear. And I think another reason I was, in hindsight, driven to form and still write a good deal in form. And I think of myself as kind of like a utility switch hitter. I don't really think of myself as a formalist or a free verse poet. I try and make contact from both sides of the plate, if I can use that strained analogy. But I want poems that sing in key. And what I mean by that is, not every poem needs the same kind of singing, but I think every poem at some level should sing a little bit. And I think it's because I'm not all that interested in the sort of colloquial speech of America anymore. That was a beautiful idea in William's time in the 30s and 40s, all these awesome immigrant voices and all that demotic speech from the shipyard or the factory or the steel mill. That's part of who we are as a people. But I got to tell you, the way we speak to each other doesn't really interest me anymore, because I just find it to be ugly and hyperbolic and so peppered with accusation and gaslighting and propaganda that increasingly I often write in a higher register speech simply because I sometimes wonder if everyday American conversational language it's failed us in some ways. And I don't know if it's what it once was, and I'm not talking about abbreviations or slang or any of that other sort of grandpa nonsense. I'm talking about just the authenticity. I don't think it's there anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the sort of voice that comes through when, especially you're engaging with form, like the sonnet, the way that if you're working with meter, you're operating with, trying to get the words to fill that metrical unit on the line and things like that too. I did want to jump into the chat because I know we have a lot of questions coming in, and I saw a few related to form. So Rebecca is asking about the relation between form and subject or content. So could you talk a little bit about that? And then Dottie had a question about, like, does the poem tell you what form it wants to be, or do you start with the form and then fit it in that way?
I think, man, these are tough, brilliant questions. I guess there's a couple different ways I can come at this. One is, most of my poems start with a snippet, some burst of language, a phrase. Sometimes it's just a word, but often it's a phrase. And every once in a while it's, part of a line or maybe a line. And sometimes, doing the dishes or going for a jog or something, sometimes we pentameter is so natural. We sometimes think about it ooga booga, but actually it's often just the patter of speech. It's the lub dub of the heart. And so when things come to me in pentameter, often I go, well, okay, let me see if I can just string this out. So if a phrase or a line comes, then I think a good, healthy reaction from any writer is to do the old clown trick, which is I've pulled a flag out of my mouth. let me just see how far I can, I'll worry about everything else later. Let me just, because I think a big challenge is just getting it out. So just keep pulling flags. But also, I think that, questions of content. I'm a believer in that whole Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright form function idea. I know that's, old fashioned and basic, but, we shouldn't have sad poems that sound happy. And I think form reflects not just a state of mind, but the posture, the relationship to our subject matter, the level of journalistic proximity. There's so many things that come with form, not to mention tone and what your sonic palette is. So all that matters. When I'm writing poems, I try not to think about any of this because I'm very streaky. I'm hot, cold. I'll go weeks with nothing, and then I'll write like 5-6 poems in a week or something. And I think of them as gush periods. So I gush and then I drought. But when any of us are in the zone, I think just keep it coming and then worry about how do the poems talk to each other? How do I sequence a book? Man, all that stuff comes later. Just keep it coming. I don't know if that answers either question or not. Maybe a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's important to think about too, is not stopping yourself before the poem has a chance to get out on the page as well, and sort of seeing what you're working with, and then saying, oh, this is kind of shaping into a sonnet. Now in revision, I can focus on that. Or maybe it wants to be free verse, and then you can focus on that as revision points too.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways to think about too. And I'll confess, I'm not somebody who really gets much out of prompts. I did it one time. Sometimes I give myself assignments just kind of break myself out of a funk, but I don't think of it so much as prompts. It's just me like carrying around a word that has a kind of private meaning that I want to work in somewhere, or an image that really is resonant. And so I've sort of kept it in my mind's eye for days or weeks until the right moment comes. But there are moments where the language kind of chats back or claps back and lets you know, hey, you've just written 2 lines and they're both they're both 6 syllables. So you can go anywhere you want, pal. but you already have 2 lines in trimeter, so maybe keep the trimeter thing go. And in that sense, I would also say that form is generative. It's generative.
Great. Also thinking about form a little bit, but thinking about the line and the use of the line in general. How do you approach your line breaks, and maybe also punctuation? Because there's some poems that don't have any punctuation, which are, they
I just dropped the coaster.
They lend themselves to really interesting reading experiences because you're sort of compounding the lines as their own units, and then you get into the syntax and things like that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your approach to line breaks and punctuation and that kind of flow.
I really strive to be a poet who tries everything, and I think that we have examples of that. And so when I think about some of my favorite poets who I'm just cherry picking to illustrate my point, but I think about like a Hayden Carruth, right? Like what is a Hayden Carruth poem? Well, I mean, he wrote everything, and I'm not saying that everything he wrote was great, but I'm just saying that he aspired to try to be, to embrace the fullness of what is possible in sort of the American range of poetry. And so I see, poets like that as giving me permission to write in strict form, or in toyed with form, or in kind of breathless, more surreal kind of riffs. And line breaks, I think, to me, are part of the music and part of the rhythm. And I don't know if in free verse or in form, these things are necessarily, I don't know. I guess I'm losing the thread of what I was trying to accomplish here. The point I was trying to make is that I don't think so much in line endings in the act of writing. To me, that's a revision concern. Although sometimes words will call out to you and say, end me here, break me here. And, that I think just comes with experience. And the more we do this, the more we hone our intuition. One of the great ironies of studying writing and aspiring to be any kind of writer is that we do this stuff consciously, but the act of writing and that initial, gush or flow or whatever is often instinctual. And it's all these things that we've learned, but we've sublimated them. And they're in there somewhere, and they are guiding what we're doing, but they are, I sometimes joke with my students, it's like there's an editor in the room, but he's like duct taped to a chair, so he's over, like you're aware that he's there. And like, you're certainly going to free him before he calls the cops and, right. Like he's in the room, but like, you're not really, occasionally he like moans through the duct tape and you're like, Bill, I'll get to you in a minute, dude. And so, but I mean, because otherwise I think that we get too cerebral and, I much rather give myself all the permission in the moment and then sort of come back to it fresh and then go, okay, is there anything of merit here? I think that was better. I brought that plane in a little bit. It was a shaky committee.
It's a great sentiment. Give yourself permission to get it on the page and experiment. I think a lot of times we become our own sort of like writer's block sometimes. And I know for myself, if I start reading what I've written as I'm writing it, then I'm totally thrown off. So I just need to keep it going. And then, anything else can happen in revision, but you can't really revise if there's nothing on the page. So.
And I think especially for folks starting out at any point in life, that whole anxiety of influence, and I'm not a huge fan of Harold Bloom, but he does have a point that when we're starting, we imitate the people we love, and then we feel, frozen by insecurity and self-doubt. And just the more you do a thing, if you are taking it seriously, incremental improvement will happen. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about the sonnet or a book of poems or skateboarding or learning how to play a simple concerto and piano. If we are taking it seriously and we're investing ourselves, then we will get better. And then we'll have sharper instincts, but I think that takes time. And we're impatient. I'm impatient. We want it now. We want it yesterday. But that's why the craft analogy is imperfect, but the one we all keep going back to, because it's a lifelong apprenticeship.
Yeah. Thinking of time, Juan had a question earlier about sort of the organization of the collection and sort of how you put that together. And I know there, we move through different narratives of childhood and adulthood, and of course there's the sort of persona historical poems. So could you just talk through that process of organization and how you conceptualize that for this collection?
So I'm glad to turn back to the book here. I feel a little bit less esoteric talking about like a physical thing, right? So about 5 or 6 years ago, this is like the biography of the book in a nutshell. I had this cockamamie idea that I was going to write a book of poems all about dragonflies because I suffer from an obsessive consciousness. And I became obsessed with dragonflies and green darners. They make the longest migration of any species on Earth. They go 3,000 miles without alighting on anything. I mean, it's just crazy. They mate midair and then fly home. And I just got overwhelmed and threw myself into the project. And after about 18 months, I had to accept that all the dragonfly poems were really bad, or that they were okay, but I didn't like them, or they just felt like I was taking news articles and it felt like I was scrapbooking. And so I had to broaden my gaze, and then I realized, oh crap, now I'm going to write a book of nature ecological poems. And I felt ill-equipped and doubtful I was capable of doing that with any kind of meaning. And so then that became the challenge, which is how do I, salvage the project and allow it to become this thing it wants to become and get out of its way, and just sort of shepherd it or steward it, which is, I think, when you have like 30 to 40 poems or 30 to 40 pages, it's almost like the project starts going, okay, pal, this is where we're really going. And then I allowed myself to write about the death of my father. My father was found dead a week before Christmas in 2016. Climate change found its way into there. And so when it came time to put the book together, I thought, there's these various threads of the body, of death and grief, but also of renewal, of the season cycle, of the world around us, of the myths we tell ourselves about the natural world, how we've objectified it, how we pretend that we're doing enough to save it. And when I looked at it all, I thought I have to do something more elemental to make this hold together. And so I arranged it by the seasons. And so we begin in summer, then we kind of descend into autumn. The third section is winter, and then we end in spring. And I was going through some health issues at the time. So my my guiding light was, I'm a huge Bill Evans fan. There's a Bill Evans album called You Must Believe in Spring. And so that was the soundtrack for the book, and got me through putting it together.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to go back through and think more consciously about that sort of seasonal shift. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the use of nature and sort of nature narratives in the poems. Thinking about, the like Planet Earth in reverse one, which is so great and very much reliant on image, and then the way that nature sort of comes through even in these more historical ones that are set in fields and sort of expansive landscapes. So I wonder if you could talk about just your approach to bringing the nature in and keeping that in mind as you were working on the book.
That's a great question. Well, it became clear after a while that there were a couple of things that I wanted the book to reject. One of which was this idea of nature as majesty, which is sort of this, I think it's very embedded in our American psyche that, we have these gorgeous national parks, and thank goodness we do. We have stunning natural wonders, one side of the country you get Niagara Falls, the other side you get the Grand Canyon. And so we're spoiled by that. We're proud of that, rightly so. We're enamored with it and we romanticize it. But I think one of the unfortunate byproducts is that we just sort of pretend that we don't have to do anything to maintain it, or that we didn't really have to earn it, that just because we showed up and took it with guns, that it belongs to us. And I didn't want to sort of look at nature as just sort of like unvarnished beauty, and that I'm sure we have some Mary Oliver fans with us tonight, so my apologies for the comment. But, in some ways, I wanted to, as I was putting it together, I was thinking, like, what is the opposite of, that goose poem? Like, look at the geese and you will be healed. And I don't think that's true. Another thing that I wanted to sort of come at was this idea that we are somehow separate from nature, and this idea that, we are somehow outside the food chain or outside the flora and fauna. We're, some sort of, by having air conditioning and Lexuses, we are somehow, we've risen above it all. And I don't think that's true at all. And, and I think that's why the body appears so much, the body in states of distress. And so, I have a poem about, a boy being turned into a eunuch against his will. I have poems about, Jesse Owens in the back end of his career as his legs were starting to fail him. And so, trying to think about the body and saying, man, it's not that much different from everything else, right? It's green for a time, but then that time passes, we got to make sense of that.
Yeah. And I'm seeing a little bit of that relationship too in the Abel and Cain kind of partner poems that are in the book separately, but that sort of relationship between will and the body. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's.
And I also, just as a quick aside, I love that you noticed that I have a Cain poem and an Abel poem that I didn't put together. I'm a believer that I love the idea of a book being recursive and echoey. And I think very much in musical terms too, when I'm putting together a book and going against, like figuring out what would be intuitive and then like going against it, right? Like another poet would say, I have, a fourth or a fifth of the book is about the passing of a parent. Well, let me cluster all those poems together. One of the first things I knew was that all the poems about my dad needed to be flung away from each other. They had to be, all throughout. And, that to me is a much more interesting approach. And so that the book isn't just talking to the poet and isn't just talking to the reader. The book is also talking to itself.
Mm-hmm. And that feels very much connected as well to that idea of nature and the way that there's patterns and echoes in nature, and that sort of, Lee in the chat is talking about how trees communicate with each other and things like that. So I think that's all very much like form related to content in a way, on a larger scale too. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, Michelle is circling back. Earlier you mentioned that you think poetry is experiencing a renaissance. Can you talk more about that and explain why you think that's true?
Well, I think it's objective fact. We have when we, regardless of one's political feelings, when we see a young poet like Amanda Gorman at a presidential inauguration, when we have a poet like Joy Harjo, who for the first time in US history, we have a poet laureate serving a third term. And I don't know where she gets the energy, but I wish I could find a way to bottle it and put it in my coffee. And I think we look at American culture, poetry is far more visible than it was when I was coming up. And, I think the internet, for all of its ugliness and doom, has facilitated a burgeoning literary community. It's given birth to dozens of respected journals and presses, and it's bringing like-minded folks together. And I think that I'm not praising a sort of smarmy conference networking, which is there if people want it. What I'm really praising is that people are finding each other. And I think that particularly young poets right now, I think are in the vanguard. And I'm so proud for all the maybe issues that might be raised about quote unquote the new sincerity aesthetically. Man, I think it's a great time. We just had Terrence Hayes in a Dove commercial. For those of us who are basketball fans, I mean, how gangster and awesome is that? Terrence Hayes in a Dove men's commercial during Final Four week. And I mean, he's just hanging out with rock stars and NBA legends. And, this is cool stuff. And, we got the president of the United States, again, regardless of how one feels, quoting Seamus Heaney from time to time. I mean, these things did not happen 30 years ago. And I'm a glass half empty person, but if we're looking at things to inspire us and to cling to and say hope and truth and goodness are worth fighting for, the fact that poetry is renewing itself in real time and reaching Americans in a way that perhaps it hasn't since the Kennedy years, where we had Frost, reading at inauguration. I mean, it's probably been 2 generations in this country since we've had poetry selling the way it's selling and visible in the way that it's visible. I mean, wasn't Kevin Young on the Daily Show a year or 2 ago? Right? I mean, I could keep going. I'm sure, the friends here tonight, are thinking of things too. It's permeating the culture. Right. And the culture needs it. So that to me, and I think that in particular, if I didn't stress this enough, I think young poets, poets of color, LGBT poets, I think are really in the vanguard because the sense of urgency and moral clarity and the love and warmth, which I think we should say more too, and the acceptance of self and other, we need it now more than ever.
Yeah, we need our poets. So all the poets in the audience, this is for everyone. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think I've seen a similar thing happening. And I think a lot of readers of poetry are equally excited to see, poetry filling bookstores, poetry events
Yeah,
like this one being well attended. We're
right.
always so excited to see people clamoring for more poetry and more places publishing poetry
Yeah.
as well, which has been amazing.
And I just flatly refuse this idea that any earnest endeavor in a democracy is a zero-sum game. This idea that for poet A to advance, poet B has to suffer or be left out. I just, it's gross, and I think anytime we are vulnerable and we're being creative, it's hard not to occasionally feel pangs of jealousy or envy or self-doubt or annoyance. But I think that just comes with being creative. I think that, those are feelings that are felt by any creative person anywhere doing anything. And we just got to work through them. But, the poetry is singing right now. And I'm gonna I'll be the guy on the back riser who can't hold a tune very well, but he's mumbling along.
Rebecca is wondering, as a writer, what do you look for when you read someone else's poems?
I'm picky, and I'm not afraid to say that anymore. It's one of the gifts of early middle age. I'm just going to start saying the quiet parts out loud when I feel that the truth is warranted. But I've taken sort of an indefinite hiatus from being a book reviewer, but for several years, I was a fairly prolific book reviewer. I spent a couple of years with a magazine called Plume, and I had a monthly column. So I reviewed like 40 or 50 books in 2 years. But, I think that, I remember being young in a workshop once, and a friend of mine said, let's agree to like the poems on the page first. And I thought, no, I'm not agreeing to like any. No, I feel like I'm being kidnapped, right? Like I'm not going to agree to like anything. I haven't even read anything yet. That seems to be like a rigged game. That's like casino rules. Just because something's written down and somebody put their heart into it doesn't mean you have to like it. It certainly doesn't mean you have to buy it. And, I'm drawn to poetry that has a clear sense of the poetic line, that is sonorous, and it has a expansive diction, but also is very aware of concision. As a reader, I like a poem to be a record of smart choices, meaning that if I'm reading something and like we all do, by line 3 or 4 or 5, I catch myself editing, then it's clearly not work for me. And, I'm drawn to poets who can do things that amaze me, impress me, or beyond my skill set, which is, pretty vast. doesn't take much to breach outside of Tavel's wheelhouse. But, I'm drawn to poets who I think are marching to the beat of their own drum, and have in some ways doubled down on their own strangeness. So I'm much more interested in Bernadette Meyer than I am in Billy Collins. I'm much more interested in Charles Olson than I am in, Mary Oliver. And this to me is exclusively an aesthetic comment. This has nothing to do with personalities or who I like as people or any of that stuff, or, the period in which they lived. It's just talking aesthetically. So, I think that, I'm looking for a charge. I'm looking for the poem to grab me. And if a poem can grab me, then the whole book doesn't have to, but I'm looking for the next poem to grab me.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm in a book and they're starting to grab me left, right, and center, then I know somebody's got a real gift, and that I'm here to listen.
Yeah, that's important what you said. The poem as a record of smart choices. I like thinking that through and maybe taking that notion into revision as well.
Yeah, I'll share a brief anecdote. Some years ago, I had, being a reviews editor is a really thankless thing. So if anybody here does any book reviewing, bless you. It's service to the art. But I had somebody who reached out to me personally rather than their publisher, and they're like, "Hey, can I send you my book directly?" And I was like, "Sure, but I'm I have this role with the magazine and we get dozens of books a month, and I never make promises to anybody. And but they like kept following up with me. And finally I had to say, no, your book was not selected for review. And I wish you well and take care, and so forth and so on. We donate books to local schools and charities. But they basically asked, well, did you read it all really closely? And I felt like going, do you understand how book reviewing works? And no, I'm not having this conversation with you. But it was like, if you read 5 or 10 poems in a book and none of them sing to you or grab you or, say, hey, look at this. If there's no sense of urgency and no connection, then, time to move on, right?
Mhm.
I think a really good test, if a book has any merit, right? Read the first poem, read the last poem, and then pick something from the middle. If you got 3 clunkers, then that is a very revealing thing.
Mm.
The same way, too, that on a more positive and healthy note, if 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 3, wow you, then pony up to that cash register or that library checkout. It's a book for you. You need it.
Yeah, I feel like it's somewhat similar, maybe on a smaller scale, but to reviewing submissions for a literary journal, you're always looking for that spark. And if you get a few poems into a submission and nothing's hitting, then you kind of have to urge yourself to move on just by nature of how many submissions are coming in. So I did want to talk quickly before we really wrap up just about publishing, because at first glance, I always look at the acknowledgements first. I don't know, I'm weird that way, but I just like to know like what's going on inside the book. And you have obviously published very widely in literary journals. And you have a poem in here that was in Poet Lore, and then another poem that I recognized from Folio, where I worked on their staff when I was at AU.
Awesome.
I was like, oh, I'm seeing all these poems. But could you just talk about how you approach submitting and publishing to literary journals, and then maybe on a grander scale, like what you think the role of a literary journal is to you or to the writing community?
Absolutely. I think the healthy thing that I've decided to do, or I fell into doing, was just having different parts of my selfhood handle that separate task. I feel like the making of poetry, the reading of poetry, the celebrating of poetry, the authenticity of tonight's marvelous conversation, and I'm so grateful to have. All that is what it's really about. And so publishing is nice. It feels really good to see a poem we've worked really hard on appear in a book or a magazine. But to me, it's in some ways, I relegate that to the part of me that like fills out paperwork for my children's school, pays bills. Like, is it a magazine that I read and respect and like? Yes. Do I know it well enough? Yes. Are there submissions open? Yes. Send them the work that I feel suits them and just forget about it and move on, and sometimes we get a yes, a lot of times we get a no. But I the sort of eagerness to prove myself to myself that I felt when I was starting out, and maybe that's universal, maybe we all feel that, and we want to show ourselves that we're good at this or that we belong. It has faded for me, because really while it's lovely to have poems in magazines and stuff, really, the real fun is, the making. It's kind of a dead thing when it shows up in a magazine. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's true. I mean, what are you going to do with it? When you read it and you go, oh, I could have done that. Oh, it's over. I mean, you can certainly, I don't mean it like that, but, I'm being a little flippant because I think sometimes we think a little too much about publication. And, I think a healthy thing is to say, do it, but easy does it. It's just like paying bills. Take it seriously, respect it, do it right. Don't rush, have a designated space and time, but it's like paying bills. I think literary magazines are incredibly important. And I think that they show how vibrant and how alive and how human our literature is. And, the fact that we live in a very big country. We just spent 2 years spending a lot of that time away from others. If we want them to be communities, they can be communities. They can also become status symbols if we're not careful. One of the reasons that there's been so much chatter about Poetry Magazine in recent years is because Poetry Magazine isn't just a magazine. It's a flagship. It's a symbol. It's a luxury car and a bio, like it's all this other stuff. And so, there's going to be more scrutiny, but also more, and rightly so, indignation when they goof, and they need to be held accountable, like we should all be held accountable for our actions and words. But I think if we look at magazines simply for that, they are places where we get to talk together, where our best words, reflecting our best selves, are given space. Then that's great. And they don't have to live forever. I'm old enough to remember mimeographed little magazines that were stapled together, and sometimes you just made it with your friends in high school, or I grew up outside Annapolis. It was kind of an artsy bohemian town, and you'd go to Goodwill or you'd go to a show on a Friday night, and somebody's just got little pamphlets of little handmade chapbooks or whatever. I mean, Fells Point in Baltimore, a very artsy scene. I mean, it's just, I'm not saying that we all have to be on the street handing out our homemade pamphlets, although if that's your style, okay, cool. But having a little bit of humility and a little bit of humor is a really great way to prevent ourselves from overthinking the currency of this, the currency of publishing, and to stay grounded in what matters, which is each other and the poems themselves. And that way, when good things happen, they feel truly joyous rather than just numb. And when disappointment or rejection happens, you accept that's the price of admission for being a writer. That is about as healthy as I've been able to figure things out. I don't know if that helps anybody or not.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm holding on to what you said about literary journals being a place for us to be in conversation together. I mean, my approach as an editor is largely, how do we put these poems in different orders to put them in different conversations? And I think that thinking of it as another way of community building, maybe in pages or maybe on someone's website, but the connections that you make across a literary journal is so important too.
Yeah.
Well, this is the worst part of the night because we are at our hour. So I just want to thank you, Adam, for your generosity and just for everything tonight. And thank you to our audience for asking amazing questions. Please, everybody, buy the book. It's amazing. And I can't wait to go back and look through things with this craft chat in mind. So thank you so much, Adam, for your words of wisdom and for your printed words as well.
I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to be. I can't believe dozens of folks came out to hear me talk on a Thursday night. So I'm just really grateful. And the book is not only available at Bookshop, but from the distributor and some other booksellers whose names I won't mention, but it's there. And also I'm at adamtavel.com if anybody wants to find my other books, or just drop me a note. But it's been an honor and a pleasure, and I'm grateful to be here. And I wish you all well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.